The airport was already awake before sunrise. Rolling suitcases echoed softly across the wide halls, and the smell of coffee filled the air as travelers hurried to their gates. Among the crowd was a woman dressed in a light blue sweater and jeans, walking with quiet confidence yet no sign of hurry. She looked like any other passenger, someone about to board a plane and move on with her day. Her hair was tied neatly and her backpack looked well used but clean. She didn't stand out, and that was exactly how she liked it. When she reached the boarding gate, she took a small breath and smiled politely at the attendant before handing over her ticket. The woman at the counter scanned it and nodded with a friendly, "Have a safe flight." She returned the smile, walked down the narrow jet bridge, and entered the airplane. The familiar cool air hit her face, the mix of metal, cleaning products, and something faintly sweet. She found her seat near the window and sat down quietly, placing her backpack under the seat in front of her. The cabin slowly filled with people, families, business travelers, and a few students chatting excitedly about their trip. A man in his 40s took the seat beside her, nodding politely. He looked like the kind who traveled often, laptop already out, earphones in. She gave a small smile before turning to the window, watching as ground staff moved across the tarmac like tiny figures in yellow jackets. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw 3 missed calls. Unknown number. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, and then she simply deleted the notifications. She didn't even open them. It was as if she knew better than to answer calls like that. Outside, the sky was soft gray and a light drizzle streaked across the window. The woman leaned her head against the seat, letting out a quiet sigh. To anyone watching, she was just another traveler, calm, quiet, maybe even tired. But there was something in her eyes that carried weight, like a story that hadn't been told in a long time. The flight attendants walked through the aisles, checking seatbelts and overhead bins. The pilot's voice soon came over the speakers, steady and warm, explaining the flight time and weather conditions. People settled in, adjusting pillows and seatbacks. As the engines roared to life, the woman closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, but in memory. The sound of engines always brought something back to her, a reminder of days when her world revolved around those sounds. Days when she sat behind screens listening to radio static and guiding voices through the skies. She blinked away the thought and looked outside as the plane began to roll forward. When the plane lifted off, some passengers gasped quietly as the ground fell away beneath them. The man beside her gripped his armrest for a second, smiling awkwardly as if embarrassed. She noticed but didn't say anything, just offered a reassuring look that somehow made him relax. About an hour into the flight, the captain announced that they might experience mild turbulence due to strong air currents. Almost instantly, passengers began fastening seatbelts again, some glancing nervously at each other. The plane jolted slightly and a few gasps filled the cabin. The woman, however, remained still. Her eyes were on the small blinking light outside the wing. Her expression didn't change. She was calm, almost too calm. The man beside her noticed and chuckled lightly to ease his nerves. "You seem used to this," he said. She turned her head slightly. "A little," she replied softly. "You could say I've seen worse skies." Her tone carried something unspoken, something layered beneath the words. The man smiled and nodded, not sure what to make of it. As the turbulence passed, she pulled out a small silver bracelet from her wrist and traced the tiny engraved letters with her thumb. It was worn, the edges dull from time. 3 faint characters were visible if one looked closely. E17. She looked out the window again, the reflection of the sky in her eyes. For a brief moment, she seemed somewhere else entirely. Not in that seat, not in that plane, but back in a world filled with radio chatter and blinking lights. When the seatbelt sign turned off, she reached down to grab her backpack. Inside was a small notebook, the pages slightly torn and yellowed. She opened it, revealing a few handwritten notes and a photograph tucked in the corner. It showed her standing near an aircraft dressed in uniform, smiling among a small group of people. The photo looked old and the people around her seemed like distant ghosts now. She stared at it for a few seconds before sliding it back inside. No one noticed except the flight attendant passing by, who caught a glimpse of her calm face and thought how composed she looked compared to others. Hours went by, and the flight remained peaceful. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as lunch service began. The man beside her made small talk, where she was headed, what she did for a living. She answered politely but vaguely. She said she was taking a break from work, that she'd been away for a while. That was all. He smiled, clearly curious but too polite to ask more. As the flight continued, dark clouds began forming in the distance. The pilot's voice came over again, assuring everyone that they were adjusting altitude to avoid rough weather. Passengers relaxed, some already watching movies or sleeping. But the woman kept her eyes on the horizon. There was something in her silence that didn't match the moment. It wasn't worry, it was awareness. Like she could read the air, like she knew when something wasn't quite right. She reached for her drink, her hand steady, her eyes alert. Then, a faint sound crackled from the intercom near the front of the cabin. It was barely noticeable. A short static noise followed by silence. Most passengers ignored it, but her head lifted instantly. That kind of static, she knew it too well. Her breathing slowed. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. Old habit, she thought. You're not in that life anymore. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this flight. The plane leveled out again, and things returned to normal. A baby cried softly and the hum of engines filled the space once more. Still her thoughts wandered. It had been years since she'd left her old job. Years since she'd spoken over a military frequency. She had promised herself she would never go back, no matter how much she missed the sky. Yet sitting there, surrounded by strangers thousands of feet above the ground, she couldn't deny that part of her still belonged here, not as a passenger, but as someone who once had control, someone whose voice mattered in the air. She looked out the window again, watching the light break through the clouds. For a moment it painted everything gold, and her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. The man beside her leaned over slightly. "You really love flying, don't you?" he asked. She smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You could say that," she replied. "Though it's not always as peaceful as it seems." He laughed lightly. "You sound like a pilot." Her eyes softened, almost wistful. "Not anymore," she said quietly. The rest of the flight seemed uneventful, but the air around her carried something unspoken, like the calm before something unexpected. She closed her eyes, resting her head back, but her fingers unconsciously brushed the bracelet again. E-17 in her dreams, she heard the faint echo of radio voices. Calm, precise, urgent. Echo 17, confirm your frequency. Copy that, tower. Maintain heading, you're clear for landing. It was strange how some memories never really fade. Even after leaving it all behind, the call signs, the codes, the pressure, they still lived somewhere deep inside her, waiting for the right moment to wake up again. When she opened her eyes, the plane was still cruising smoothly above the clouds. The sun had begun to set, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to simply admire it without thinking of coordinates, altitudes, or signals. The captain's voice came through once more, soft and casual, announcing that they were on schedule and everything looked clear ahead. Passengers clapped lightly and a few smiled in relief. The woman smiled too. For now it was just another flight, just another peaceful evening in the sky. She didn't know that before this journey ended, her calm would be tested again, that her past would find her at 30,000 feet, and her old call sign would echo once more. But at that moment she was content being invisible. Just another passenger among many. Just someone watching the horizon fade into night, unaware that soon every eye on that plane would turn toward her. Not because of who she was, but because of what she was once called. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. The passengers had settled into a comfortable silence after dinner service. Some were watching movies, others reading or trying to sleep. The woman by the window still hadn't closed her eyes. Her gaze stayed fixed on the clouds drifting past, their edges lit faintly by the moonlight. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That kind of calm that comes right before something changes. She reached into her bag, took out a small pair of earphones, and plugged them into her phone. But instead of music, she opened a voice recording app and scrolled through old files. Her thumb hovered over one titled Echo 17 Final Transmission. For a moment she considered playing it. Then she sighed softly and put the phone face down on the tray table. The man beside her stirred slightly, stretching his arms. "Can't sleep?" he asked in a quiet voice. She smiled faintly. Not really. I'm used to staying awake when everyone else is asleep. He chuckled. Night shifts? Something like that, she said. The flight attendants dimmed the lights further, and soon the cabin was wrapped in a soft, bluish glow. Outside, the stars were scattered like tiny sparks over the dark sky. The woman glanced out, and for a second, she could almost imagine she was back in a control room again, screens glowing, radios buzzing, voices calling out coordinates. She pushed the thought away and leaned back in her seat. Just then, the plane gave a small jolt. Nothing major, just enough to make a few passengers wake up. A few nervous whispers followed. The captain's voice came over the speakers, calm and measured. Ladies and gentlemen, we're passing through a minor weather pocket. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control. The familiar steadiness of his tone reminded her of her own voice years ago when she spoke through radio lines. Calm. Focused. Never letting others hear the worry underneath. The plane steadied again, and everyone relaxed. But inside the cockpit, something else was happening. The co-pilot frowned, looking at the communication panel. There was an incoming signal on an unusual frequency, a distress tone, short and sharp. Captain, are you hearing this? The co-pilot asked quietly. The captain leaned closer, listening. The signal repeated, 3 quick beeps, a pause, then 3 more. It wasn't random. It was a coded emergency ping used by aircraft communication systems, but this one wasn't coming through the main channel. That's odd, the captain murmured. Could be interference. The co-pilot nodded, but both knew it didn't sound like interference. It sounded deliberate. In the cabin, no one noticed anything yet. The woman adjusted her seatbelt and closed her eyes, trying to rest. But something, a faint static sound over the speakers, made her eyes open again. It was barely noticeable, but it hit her like a memory. That sound. She sat up slightly, listening. It came again, soft static, followed by silence. She felt her heartbeat pick up, not from fear, but recognition. Inside the cockpit, the captain switched frequencies, trying to trace the signal. It was weak but persistent. Then, through the static, a faint voice broke in. Mayday, Mayday, this is flight. The rest was lost in static. The captain straightened instantly. The co-pilot looked at him. It's an aircraft distress call, he said quietly. The captain nodded and tried to respond, switching to the international emergency frequency. This is Flight 972. We copy your signal. Identify yourself. No answer. Just static. A few minutes passed and the signal faded. The captain sat back, uncertain. If it's real, they might be losing power, he said. We'll notify air traffic control. The co-pilot began typing a report to the air control tower, but before he could send it, another voice came faintly through the frequency. Echo 17, do you copy? The woman in the cabin froze. Her chest tightened. That word, her old call sign, cut through her like electricity. She looked around quickly. No one else seemed to react. The man beside her was dozing off, completely unaware. She leaned closer to the intercom speaker above her seat. Maybe it was her imagination. But no, it came again. Echo 17. This is Command Tower Delta. Are you receiving? Her hands trembled slightly. It couldn't be real. That call sign hadn't been used in years. Nobody even knew she was on this flight. She tried to calm her breathing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe another unit had reused the call sign. But deep down, she knew. Those codes weren't reused, not ones like hers. She looked toward the front of the cabin. The cockpit door was closed, but she could almost feel something happening behind it. The man beside her stirred again. Everything okay? He asked groggily. She forced a small smile. Yes. Just thought I heard something. He nodded sleepily and turned back to his seat. She unbuckled her seatbelt quietly and stood up, pretending to stretch her legs. The flight attendant smiled at her as she walked past, and she smiled back politely, heading toward the restroom. But she stopped short near the galley, close to the cockpit door. She could hear faint voices from inside, muffled but urgent. She hesitated. She didn't want to draw attention, but she couldn't ignore it either. After a moment, she took a step closer. The door opened slightly as one of the flight attendants stepped out. The woman quickly straightened, pretending to reach for a cup of water. The attendant smiled and closed the door behind her. "Everything all right?" the woman asked casually. The attendant's smile was polite but tense. "Just some technical signals the pilots are checking. Nothing to worry about." The woman nodded, her expression calm though her heart was racing. When she returned to her seat, she stared at the window again. Her reflection looked back at her, and she barely recognized it. She hadn't felt that mix of fear and focus in years. The plane continued smoothly, but her thoughts were anything but calm. She thought of the years she'd spent in the Air Force, the days filled with noise and commands. She remembered the night she had chosen to walk away, leaving behind the headset, the call sign, and everything that came with it. And now, here it was again, calling her out of nowhere. She closed her eyes and leaned back, whispering softly under her breath, "No, not again, not this time." But fate didn't ask for permission. A few minutes later, the captain made an announcement. His tone was steady, but something in it felt different, slightly heavier. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received word of an aircraft in our region experiencing technical difficulties. There is no danger to our flight, but air traffic control has asked us to stay in communication and possibly assist with relaying signals if needed. Everything remains under control." The passengers looked up, murmuring softly, but most went back to what they were doing after a moment. Only one person understood the weight of what he'd just said. Her. She felt the chill spread through her body. She didn't know the details yet, but if an aircraft nearby was in distress and her old call sign had been mentioned, that meant someone, somewhere, knew she was here. She glanced down at her bracelet again, the faint letters catching the dim light, E-17. Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and instinct. She wanted to stay silent, stay invisible, but every part of her training screamed that she couldn't. The man beside her noticed her unease. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. She blinked and forced another faint smile. "Yes, just thinking." He nodded, sensing there was more but choosing not to press. The captain's voice returned briefly. "We'll keep everyone updated. Please remain calm." She looked toward the cockpit again. The decision was already forming in her mind. She couldn't ignore it, not if another aircraft's life was on the line. But how could she step forward without exposing who she was? Without reopening the part of her life she had spent years trying to forget? She exhaled slowly and stared out at the night sky. The clouds below looked endless, like an ocean of silver mist. Somewhere out there, another plane might be struggling to stay in the air, and someone had reached out using her name. Her fingers gripped the armrest. She knew what she had to do. For now, she would wait. Listen. Watch. The moment she was certain, she would act. And deep in her chest, she felt that old steadiness return, the same calm she used to feel in emergencies, the same control that once defined her. The hum of the engines continued, the passengers unaware of how close their flight was to becoming part of something much bigger. As the plane moved silently through the dark sky, the woman looked down at her reflection again. The tired passenger was gone. What stared back at her was someone else, someone who once guided others through chaos, someone the skies still remembered. The faint whisper of her call sign echoed in her mind again, steady and clear. "Echo 17, do you copy?" She closed her eyes and whispered back, so quietly no one could hear. "Copy that." The quiet inside the airplane felt heavier now. Even though nothing seemed unusual to most passengers, there was an invisible tension in the air, something only she could feel. The captain's calm announcement had done its job. Everyone believed it was just a routine communication issue somewhere nearby, but she knew better. You could always tell when a voice carried more weight than the words aloud. The man sitting next to her was now fully asleep, head tilted to one side. The soft flicker of the screen in front of him cast a blue light on his face. She envied his calm, but her mind was too alert for rest. She glanced once more toward the cockpit door. Through the tiny gap when the flight attendant moved, she caught sight of the pilot's tense posture. He was listening to something through his headset. The co-pilot's hands moved quickly over the controls, and their expressions told her enough. They were trying to make contact again. Her heartbeat was steady but fast. It felt like she was back in her old seat at the command center, the air thick with static and half-heard voices. She had promised herself never to return to that life, but here she was, caught between past and present, 30,000 feet above the world. Then it happened. A soft tone played through the speakers again, barely noticeable. A static-filled voice broke through, louder this time. The words were fragmented but unmistakable. Engine failure. Losing altitude. Requesting assistance. Gasps rippled through a few rows as passengers looked up in confusion. The sound lasted only a few seconds before cutting off completely. The captain's voice quickly followed, steady as ever. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. That transmission did not come from our aircraft. Air traffic control is managing the situation. There's no cause for concern," but she knew that tone. The kind pilots used when they were trying not to alarm people. She could almost feel his thoughts. There was another aircraft nearby, and it was in serious trouble. She pressed her palms together and closed her eyes briefly. It wasn't her problem, she told herself. She wasn't part of that world anymore, but the guilt settled heavy in her chest. What if she could help? What if her experience, her knowledge, could make a difference? Before she could decide, the intercom came alive again, but this time the voice was directed only to the cabin crew. A short, urgent message. The lead flight attendant hurried toward the cockpit, her expression tight and focused. Moments later, the captain made another announcement. His words were calm, but the pause before he spoke gave him away. "If there is anyone on board familiar with advanced aviation communication or air traffic coordination, please make yourself known to a member of the crew." Her breath caught. She stared at the floor, heart racing. That wasn't a normal request. Not unless the situation was serious. People looked around curiously, whispering. A few passengers joked nervously. What, do they think someone on this plane can help? But she didn't smile. Her mind was spinning. She reached for her bracelet again, her thumb tracing over the faded letters. E-17, her old call sign. The flight attendant began walking through the aisles, her eyes scanning the passengers. When she reached her row, the woman looked up slowly. Their eyes met for just a second, and something unspoken passed between them. The attendant stopped. "Ma'am," she said softly. "The captain asked if anyone has experience with air communication or flight coordination." "Do you?" The woman hesitated. She could feel everyone around her listening. The weight of old memories pressed hard against her chest. She wanted to say no, to stay silent, but something stronger than fear pushed her to nod. "I do," she said quietly. The attendant blinked, surprised. "You do?" "I used to work in military air traffic control," she replied. "A long time ago." The attendant's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Please come with me." As she stood, she felt dozens of curious eyes following her. The man beside her woke up and looked confused as she gathered her things. She just gave a small, reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said. "I'll be back." Her steps were steady as she walked down the narrow aisle. The flight attendants moved aside, guiding her toward the cockpit. The door opened, and she stepped into the place that used to be her second home. A space filled with blinking lights, radio chatter, and tension thick enough to feel. The captain turned, his expression a mix of surprise and relief. "You're the passenger with air traffic experience?" She nodded. "Yes, what's the situation?" He gestured toward the communication panel. "We've been picking up a distress call from a nearby aircraft, short range. They've lost contact with the tower. We tried responding, but their frequency keeps dropping out." "You said you worked in control?" She nodded again, eyes already scanning the instruments. "Yes, I might be able to help reestablish signal manually." "What's the call sign of the distressed aircraft?" The co-pilot looked at his notes. "It's Flight 829, civilian transport, small carrier." She felt her stomach twist. "And what's their last known altitude?" 11,000 and dropping, the co-pilot said quietly. The captain handed her a headset. She took it without hesitation, the motion automatic, familiar. When she placed it over her ears, the faint crackle of static brought everything rushing back. The control room, the endless nights, the responsibility. She adjusted the dials, her voice calm but firm. "This is Flight 972, relaying from open frequency. Flight 829, do you copy?" Silence. She adjusted again, fine-tuning the channel. "Flight 829, this is 972, do you read?" Static. Then, faintly, a voice broke through. "This is 829. 2 engines out. Trying to maintain altitude. Losing navigation." Her heart pounded, but her tone stayed steady. "Copy that, 829. Stay calm. What's your current heading?" "Uncertain." "Instruments failing." "Okay," she said quickly. "Listen carefully. We're tracking your approximate position. Switch to backup frequency Delta Alpha. Can you do that?" There was a pause, then a broken reply. A tempting switch now. The captain watched her silently, his expression filled with respect and disbelief. Her hands moved over the controls with precision. It was like watching someone step right back into their natural element. She spoke again, voice clear and strong. 29, confirm when you've switched frequencies." A few seconds passed, then, "We're here. Delta Alpha active." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good, you're doing fine. I need you to check external visuals." "What do you see?" "Clouds, lightning in the distance." "We're in heavy turbulence," she frowned. "You're near the storm front. You need to divert south by 10 degrees immediately. Use manual control if navigation is down." "Do you have enough fuel?" "Barely," came the weak reply. "We're burning reserve." The captain looked at her. "We're near their airspace. Could we guide them visually?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "If we can get closer, I can help align them with the emergency runway signal from control." The co-pilot contacted the tower while she continued speaking calmly to the distressed aircraft, guiding them step by step through the dark. Her voice never wavered. Even when the connection faded, she stayed patient, switching channels, keeping the other crew focused. Minutes passed like hours. The air in the cockpit felt tight. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her voice. At last, the tower came back online. "We've got partial lock on Flight 829's transponder," the controller said. "Your guidance helped stabilize their path." Relief washed through the cockpit. The captain smiled faintly. "You might have just saved them." She exhaled slowly, taking off the headset. Her hands trembled slightly now that it was over. She hadn't realized how tense she'd been. "Thank you," the captain said quietly.
"I don't know how you did that, but—"
"That was incredible." She gave a small smile. "Old habits," she said softly. "Once you've done it long enough, it never really leaves you." The captain nodded. "You were military?" She hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes, long time ago. I left after it was time." He didn't press further. There was a quiet understanding between them. Some stories didn't need to be told. When she stepped back into the cabin, every passenger turned to look at her. No one spoke, but their faces said everything. Curiosity, admiration, wonder. The man in her row smiled as she sat down again. "You really were helping them, weren't you?" She nodded slightly. "Just doing what I could." He chuckled softly. "Well, I'm glad you were on this flight." She looked out the window again. The sky was calm now, stars stretching endlessly across the darkness. She watched them quietly, her reflection blending with the night. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was running from her past. She felt like she'd made peace with it, but deep down she knew it wasn't over yet. The voice that had called her old name, the one that had known her call sign, was still out there. And the message she had just helped deliver might only be part of something bigger. Still, for now, she let herself breathe. She pressed her hand against the window, the cool glass grounding her. Outside, far below, she imagined the lights of the rescued plane finding its way home. Somewhere, someone she had never met would live another day because she was on this flight, and for her that was enough. For now. The air inside the plane felt different now. It wasn't panic or fear, just a quiet awareness that something serious was happening above the clouds. Passengers whispered in low voices, wondering what was going on. Some said the woman who went to the cockpit was a pilot. Others guessed she worked with the military. Nobody really knew, but everyone could feel that her presence had changed something. She sat quietly again, trying to slow her heartbeat. Her hands were still slightly shaking, though she kept them clasped together so no one could see. The sound of her own breathing was louder than the engines for a few seconds. She thought it was over, that her help had been enough, but she was wrong. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time more tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be encountering an unexpected storm front earlier than planned. Please fasten your seatbelts. We'll be taking a minor detour." His calm tone couldn't hide the tightness underneath. She knew that sound in his voice. Something wasn't right. Outside the windows, flashes of light began to appear far off in the distance. Lightning. The clouds grew darker, and the stars that had been visible minutes ago were gone. The plane started to shake gently. The man beside her looked uneasy. "That's not normal, right?" he asked quietly. "It's fine," she said softly. "They know what they're doing," but she didn't sound convinced, not even to herself. She reached into her pocket and felt the edge of her bracelet, the engraved letters pressing into her palm. Moments later, the seatbelt sign blinked on, and the plane jolted harder. A few gasps filled the cabin. The turbulence grew rougher and the overhead bins rattled slightly. Then the captain's voice returned, slightly distorted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are experiencing temporary turbulence and adjusting our course." Temporary. She almost smiled at that word. She had used it herself many times before, trying to keep people calm when the truth was far more complicated. Suddenly, the cockpit door opened slightly, and the lead flight attendant hurried toward her. Her eyes were wide but composed. "The captain needs you again," she whispered. The woman didn't hesitate this time. She unbuckled and followed quickly, steadying herself as the plane shook again. A few passengers watched her go, whispering. Inside the cockpit, the situation was worse than before. The screens flickered occasionally from static interference, and the radio crackled nonstop. The captain turned toward her immediately. "We've lost full communication with the tower," he said. "The storm's interfering with everything." "And the distress aircraft we helped earlier?" Their transponder just went dark again. Her stomach dropped. "You mean they're still in trouble?" "They were supposed to land by now," the co-pilot said grimly. "But now the tower can't reach them. We're the only ones close enough to pick up any signal." She moved closer to the console, her old instincts taking over. "Show me the last frequency you had." The captain nodded and pointed at the panel. "It's fluctuating somewhere between 124.7 and 125.0. She leaned in, adjusted the dials manually, and listened carefully. The static roared in her ears, then softened. For a moment there was nothing but white noise. Then faintly a voice came through, shaky and barely audible. "This is 829. Losing altitude. Instruments dead." Her hand tightened around the headset. "This is Flight 972. We hear you 829. Stay calm." "Do you have any visual reference?" "Negative. Can't see anything. It's all cloud." She looked at the captain. "They're descending fast. If we can't guide them soon, they'll lose stability completely." The captain nodded quickly. "We'll try to get closer to their range. I'll adjust our altitude." As the plane banked slightly, she focused on the voice in her ear. 829, I need you to check your backup compass. Tell me the direction it's pointing." After a pause, the voice came again, more desperate. "Compass spinning. Can't stabilize." She exhaled slowly. "All right. Listen carefully. I'm going to guide you using our signal strength. Follow my instructions exactly." "Copy," the pilot on the other end said weakly. The passengers in her own plane had no idea that. Just beyond the walls of the cabin, two aircraft were now moving through the same storm, one fighting to survive while the other tried to guide it home. The storm hit harder. The plane jolted sharply and lights flickered overhead. Even inside the cockpit, the noise of thunder was deafening. The captain kept his focus, his hands tight on the controls. "Can we maintain altitude?" she asked. "Barely," he said through clenched teeth, "but we'll hold it as long as needed." Her voice stayed calm even when her heart was racing. 829, you're going to hear some interference. Ignore it and keep your wings level. I'm sending you a steady pulse signal. Align your flight with that rhythm. Do you understand? Roger, trying. Every few seconds she adjusted the radio pulse, creating a faint beacon. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. An invisible path through chaos. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, but she didn't notice. Her eyes stayed locked on the flickering radar. The captain and co-pilot barely spoke, following her cues without question. Then the connection started breaking again. Signal fading, the distant voice said. Don't lose it, she said firmly. Keep your wings level. Stay with me, 829, you're almost through the worst of it. Lightning flashed outside the cockpit window so bright it turned the sky white for an instant. She flinched but didn't stop. The co-pilot checked his instruments. We've got them on partial radar, 12 miles southwest. Good, she said. That's close enough. Keep our course steady. The captain nodded. If they hold this line, they'll clear the storm in 10 minutes. She kept her voice steady on the radio, guiding the other pilot through each adjustment. Every word was precise, measured, calm. Level your wings. Reduce descent slightly. Maintain heading 215. You're doing great. Copy that. Following your lead, came the shaky reply. Then suddenly silence. She tapped the controls. 829, do you copy? Nothing. 829 responds, still nothing. Just the low hum of interference, her stomach twisted. She looked at the captain. They're gone again. The co-pilot's fingers flew over the radar panel. Wait, yes, faint reading. Altitude rising slightly. She closed her eyes for a moment, whispering under her breath. Come on. Hold on. Then faintly the voice returned, clearer than before. This is 829. We're through the clouds. I can see ground lights. Relief hit the entire cockpit like a wave. The captain grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. You did it, but she wasn't smiling yet. Not until they land safely. She kept talking to them, guiding them step by step. Stay steady. You're less than 5 miles from the emergency runway. You'll see the beacon soon. Keep descending gradually. Don't rush it. The other pilot's voice broke with emotion. Copy. I see the beacon. Thank you. Thank you. She finally allowed herself to exhale. You're welcome. You're almost home. When the tower finally confirmed that Flight 829 had landed safely, the cockpit went completely quiet. The captain leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face. The co-pilot smiled faintly, shaking his head. Unbelievable, the captain said softly. You just guided a plane through a storm from another aircraft. She took off the headset slowly, her hands trembling. They did it, she said quietly. They saved themselves, I just reminded them how. The captain turned to her, his voice sincere. You did more than that. You saved lives tonight. She didn't answer. Her eyes were distant, lost somewhere between pride and exhaustion. When she finally stepped back into the cabin, everyone turned to look at her again. The plane had steadied, and the storm outside was already fading. Passengers looked at her with silent gratitude, though they didn't even know the full story. She smiled weakly at the flight attendant who met her in the aisle. They're safe, she whispered. The attendant's eyes softened. You should sit. You've done enough. Back in her seat, the man beside her was wide awake now, looking both amazed and confused. You were up there again, weren't you? Helping. She gave a small nod. Just doing what I used to do. He smiled. Well, I don't know what you used to do, but I'm glad you're on this plane. She looked out the window again. The clouds were breaking apart, and the first signs of dawn were starting to appear on the horizon. Soft pink light spread across the sky, touching the edge of the wing. For a moment, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. The storm was over, not just outside, but inside her too. She had spent years running from her past, convincing herself that she'd left that world behind. But now she understood something. She hadn't lost that part of her. It had always been there, waiting for the right moment to return. The captain's voice came on once more, calm and warm now. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been informed that the nearby aircraft we assisted has landed safely. Thank you for your patience, and a special thanks to one of our passengers who made that possible. The cabin filled with quiet applause. She looked down, a shy smile forming on her lips. She didn't crave attention. She only felt relief. As the plane continued toward its destination, she leaned her head against the window, watching the light grow brighter. The night had tested her, but it had also reminded her of who she truly was. Not just another passenger. Not anymore.